The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp, the preacher at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. And with us as our co-host on the program, as always, is Trevor Campbell. Trevor, good evening.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Well, tell folks how to get in touch with you, please, if they have a question.
Yeah, you can contact me by phone, 870-435-2737. And you'll also see on the screen there kind of the directions to where we worship. I worship in Payette. I also preach there. And we're right off Highway 62 next to the tractor dealership. We meet at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings for a Bible class and 10:45 for worship. We invite you to come to both of those. We'd love to have you.
And the reason Trevor is telling you how to get in touch with him, and in just a moment I'll tell you how to get in touch with me, is because we invite your questions. We want to answer your questions from the Bible on this program. And you can get in touch with me, Keith Sharp, by calling me at 870-321-5746, or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or if you prefer, you can write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. We invite your questions. I want to remind you also of the services of the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. We meet on Highway 5, 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass on the left, on the way to Calico Rock and Mountain View. We have our Sunday morning classes at 10 o'clock, Bible classes for all ages. We have our worship assembly at 11 o'clock. We have an assembly at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And then we have our midweek services at 7 o'clock Wednesday night. We also have a ladies class that meets at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. I hear very good things concerning these ladies' studies. We invite the ladies that live in this area to come out and be a part of that ladies' class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday mornings. So we invite you to attend our services. Well, we have a question. Actually, it was made in the form of a statement. And that statement was made to one of our members. And the statement was, "You're those folks who don't believe in taking care of orphans." That's kind of a shocking statement, isn't it, Trevor?
Yeah,
Trevor,
it is.
do you believe in taking care of orphans?
I certainly do.
Well, where could we turn to see any obligation that we have in caring for orphans? And by the way, let me add widows to that mix.
Yeah, widows as well. Yeah, orphans and widows. Very good. Well, did you want to start in James chapter 1? You had mentioned that.
You start this how you want to. I flipped it over to you, so it's all yours, Trevor.
I'm in control here. All right. I actually would like to start in the Old Testament, if we would, and that's, I want to go to Psalms, the 68th Psalm. It's just a brief passage, but what I kind of wanted to establish here, and what the Bible establishes, I should say, is that God does have concern for orphans and widows. And in the 68th Psalm, and in verse 5, this is David speaking, by the way, and he's talking about God. He says, "A father of the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy habitation." All right, so he's describing the character of God, who God is. God does have concern and compassion on these individuals. Orphans, or the fatherless, he mentions, fatherless and widows. And maybe we ought to just briefly talk about the verse just for a moment. A father of the fatherless. Well, what does a father do? He provides and he protects. That's two of the things that he does. And so God does look out for these individuals. And then he mentions a defender of widows. Now, I'm reading from the New King James Version of the Bible. The Old King James actually uses the word judge, that he's a judge for the widows. And I kind of like that, because the idea there is he's an advocate for them. He's going to make sure that seek justice on their behalf, to make sure they're provided for and cared for and taken care of.
All right.
So I like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So that
that's the very
establishes
nature of God.
That's the very nature. There you go.
So
of God.
should we reflect that nature in our lives?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the way that he does help to protect and provide for these individuals is through the laws that he's given us,
All right.
instructions he's given us on how to treat these individuals.
Well, can you tell me some of those laws that he's given us instructions?
Well, sure. But I would like to stay just for a moment in the Old Covenant.
Sure.
If that's right, the Old Testament. All right, I want to go to Exodus in the Old Law.
I'm going to interrupt you just a minute and make the statement about using the Old Covenant. It's a shadow of the things to come, and we
Yes.
find examples of how God deals with his people. It's not our law, but examples of how God deals with his people from the Old Covenant. So go ahead, Trevor.
Very good. No, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
That's very good. Yes. So this kind of shows us the character of God too, though, and his concern again and compassion on these individuals. And as you said, it's not a law that's binding on us. In Exodus chapter 22, though, God shows us the seriousness of mistreating these individuals, both orphans and widows alike. In Exodus chapter 22, and beginning at verse 22, he says, "You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless." Pretty serious stuff.
That's very serious, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty serious stuff
So
indeed.
if you mistreat the orphans and the widows under the Old Covenant,
Yeah.
then your children will become orphans and your wives will become widows.
Yeah.
That's a very serious threat that God's making to Israel.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah.
And that shows the seriousness of his concern for those helpless. And that, I believe, is the whole point about orphans and widows.
Yeah.
These are helpless people.
Right. They're people that need help from others, exactly. Another example is over in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 14. And I like this because you mentioned a moment ago the Old Covenant being a shadow of those things which was to come. I think in a little bit here we'll probably get into James chapter 1 and talk about the New Covenant, what it has to say about orphans and widows. But here's kind of a shadow of that. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 14, and I'm going to begin in verse 28. Now, again, this is the Old Covenant and the Old Law. But he says in verse 28, "At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce that year, and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your gates, may come and eat and be satisfied." Now, this next part right here is what I was making mention of, a shadow of the things to come. He says, "That the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do." See, God gave to the Israelites blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. In fact, those things are laid out in Deuteronomy chapter 28. He just lists a number of blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. Well, in the blessings, if they did what God asked them to do, then he would give them rain in its season. He'd give them a plentiful produce. Everything would be good for them. Just things would go well for them, protection from their enemies and so forth. But if they disobeyed, the opposite took place. And so what he's saying here is if your religion and your practice and your worship to me, in that worship, in your diligence to me, you need to pay attention to the fatherless and the widow and follow this command that provides for these individuals. If you don't, then he is going to send the curses upon them. Okay. And that was given in Deuteronomy 28, which we're not going to read. It's very lengthy, but you can read it on your own time.
But there's a list here actually of 4 classes of people in Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 29. The Levite, well, those were men who were descended from Levi who were working in the temple. And they did not have their own land inheritance. And so they were dependent on, these were people who were giving their lives to the service of God. Sure. And dependent upon the goodwill and the help of the Israelites. And then he lists the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Of course, the fatherless or the orphans and the stranger. Now, these were people who had settled in with Israel, though they were not descended from Jacob.
Right.
They were Gentiles, and they had to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. In other words, they had to be proselytized to Judaism, but they had no land inheritance. And so they were dependent upon the goodwill of the Israelites. So here again are people who are dependent on others' goodwill in order to receive support, because they have no way themselves of supporting themselves. And as those that cannot support themselves, Israel was to be concerned about them, and that's how that their third year tithe was to be used, was to help these people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Trevor, please.
All right. Well, he says that he would bless them in the work of their hand if they followed these commands. And so he's teaching them to have compassion as well, and it was a command for them, but also showing that this is part of what God wanted them to be, and that's also shown in the New Testament. That reflects in the New Testament. God wants us to be those kind of individuals that will look out for our fellow man. And again, we're talking about those in need, that have a need. And of course, that would be orphans and widows. There's clearly a need there. There's a hole there that needs to be filled, so to speak. And so we are to help them.
All right, so where in the New Testament do we read that we are to help the orphans and the widows?
I mentioned James chapter 1 a moment ago, and I think that's a good place to go. James chapter 1. And beginning in verse 26, I believe, is where we should, it's a good place to start. He says, "If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his own tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world."
All right. So pure religion is a practical religion. Yeah. I've sometimes said that religion is faith put into practice. And pure religion is not only keeping yourself unspotted from the world, there's the negative. You don't practice the works of the flesh. But there's also positive to it. You're helpful to those who are helpless.
Yeah.
You help the widows and the orphans. Those, again, are the helpless ones. They depend on others for the necessities of life. Well, I want to add a question to this then, Trevor. So it's our obligation then to care for the widows and the orphans. And that's just actually a part of our obligation to help the helpless.
Yeah.
But that's central to it, helping the widows and the orphans. Has God told us how to do that, or has He just left it up to us to do it any way we want to?
Well, He's definitely left us commands and examples, for that matter, in the New Testament that show us how to go about those things.
Okay.
I'm thinking 1 Timothy. Would that be a good place to start?
I think that's an excellent place.
1 Timothy chapter 5. 1
Timothy chapter 5. Go right ahead, Trevor.
Okay, you want me to read it? Okay. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let's go ahead and begin at just verse 3 is fine.
Sure.
It says, "Honor widows who are really widows, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God." So we might just pause there to make a note of what he's talking about here. How can a widow be or not be really a widow?
Yeah.
But what he's talking about is the idea of somebody who's truly left alone, I believe.
Right. That's right.
Truly in need.
The word widow, the root meaning of the word is desolate.
Okay.
So here's someone who's truly desolate. We would say she has no one.
Yeah, she has no one, right.
Okay, so that's truly a widow. She's truly desolate. She has no one to help her, to care for her, who is kin to her.
Who is kin to her, right. But in verse 4, he teaches us that if there are children or grandchildren, well, she's not truly alone. And those individuals have an obligation. I would have an obligation in my family to provide for that individual, take care, or make sure the needs are provided for in that situation. And he says that is good and acceptable before God. All right, so going back to that pure and undefiled religion there, that would meet that as well. Verse 5, he says, "Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever."
Okay, well, let me stop you right there on verse 8. So, Trevor, supposing I'm still young,
Okay.
and my children are young, and I have a brother, and he has, and this, by the way, is the fact, and he has children also, and they're young. If my brother, something were to happen to him, and he didn't leave adequate insurance, he dies, he doesn't leave adequate insurance, whose obligation would it be to care for his widow and his orphans?
It'd be yours.
My obligation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, should I just shove that off on somebody else?
No.
Oh, it's my obligation.
It's God. Yeah, God has given you that obligation.
Well, what if I won't do that?
Well, he says, you've denied the faith.
Oh,
and you're worse
that's
than an unbeliever.
serious,
So,
isn't it?
Pretty serious, yeah.
That's very
Yeah,
serious.
You're cursed in essence there, yeah.
So if I won't take care of my own,
yeah.
now it's not just those in my household, because it says especially for those of his household.
Especially, right.
So my own or others then who are in my household.
Yeah.
I want to give an example of this that I see. As you know, I've been to Africa several times, and I have a number of African friends, and preachers were friends of mine. And they have a much higher death rate. They have a lower life expectancy in the places in Africa. Very sad where I've been. And a number of these preachers have not just the children who were born to them and to their wife, but they have children who are their brother's children or their sister's children, or even children who were members, their parents were members of the congregation. They've taken into their homes and are raising them. I could name names, but that's all right. You don't know these people. Taking them into their own homes, and they're raising them as their own children.
Wow.
Would this be a fulfillment of 1 Timothy 5, verse 8?
Absolutely.
Well, why don't we do that in America?
Well, we should. and you know, that's tremendous sacrifice, but that's what God is saying that He expects.
And so, what about a person? Or I'm sorry, interrupt.
Oh, it's okay.
Go ahead.
True act of love.
That's right. That's
definitely,
exactly right. And so, a person who has nephews, nieces, who are dependent children, who are kin to them, and that person will not take them into their own home and help them. What about that person, according to the Apostle Paul?
Well, that's what he's saying. They're the same. They've denied the faith. That individual, should take that responsibility, and really should gladly try to take on that responsibility.
Wow, that's serious, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It
so,
is.
Do you believe in taking care of orphans?
I certainly do.
Do you believe in taking care of widows?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, well, add me to that number. That is, of those who believe in taking care of orphans and widows, but
Absolutely.
in the way that God commands in His Word. Go ahead,
Right.
Trevor. You were going to talk further about 1 Timothy 5, I think.
No, I think that's good. That's good. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I want to skip on down now.
Okay.
It goes ahead to talk about the widows indeed and the qualifications for being the widow indeed, or what the New King James calls truly a widow. And they're to be enrolled by the church as a dependent of the church. But notice, to be enrolled as a dependent of the church, she has to meet some qualifications. They're pretty stringent qualifications.
Absolutely, you're right. Yes.
To be truly a widow that is someone who is truly desolate.
Yeah.
But she is a godly woman. Well, instead of me just commenting, let's go ahead and read, beginning in verse 9, and verses 9 and 10. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So widow cannot be enrolled to be cared for by the church unless she meets those on a permanent basis.
Yes.
Unless she meets those qualifications of verses 9 and 10. Is that right, Trevor?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, now that's the Lord's way of doing things.
Right,
And so I guess the question is, should we follow the Lord's way or our own way?
Right. Right, exactly.
Okay. By the way, we skipped over. I want to go back and get this. When it says back in verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. Does it mean that we just call them ma'am, or we only call them by their last name, Mrs. So-and-so? What does it mean to honor widows?
Well, I think he's explaining it in this portion here of the text.
Okay.
It's more than just that, but it's the action.
Okay.
Yeah.
An example of that in the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7, and I'll hit this quickly, about the Old Testament said, honor your father and your mother. And by the way, that's an Old Testament command that's repeated by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, to honor your father and mother. And the Pharisees had said, whatever help that my father and mother would have received, it's korban, that's Mark chapter 7, or it's a gift to the temple, and so I don't have to honor my father and mother. Yeah. And so the point is, you honor your father and mother, at least this is one way you honor your father and mother, by financial support of them in their old age when they cannot support themselves.
Right.
And so the honor here definitely includes, in fact, in this context, it's primarily talking about financial help, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the widows indeed, they're to be permanently enrolled as a charge of the church. The church is to care for them.
Right.
Other widows, well, who's to care for them?
Well, it's the responsibility of the family members, as he's already established.
They're kinfolks. All right. Now, go down to verse 16. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows, that is, the ones he's talked about in verses 9 and 10. All right, so the church has the obligation to relieve the widows indeed, the really widows that are described in verses 9 and 10. But I've given this example before, I'll give it again. I lived in upstate New York for 14 years, and my widowed mother lived in Little Rock. Now just suppose, now I didn't do this and I would not have done this, but just suppose that she gets in touch with me and says, Keith, I can't pay my grocery bill. I can't pay to heat the house. I need some financial help. Could I have said to her, well, Mother, you're a member of a church there in Central Arkansas. You go to them and you get them to help you. Could I have done that?
No, you can't do that. And that's what this is stating right here.
Whose obligation was she?
Yours, verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, it's your responsibility to
relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened. So my kinfolks are in need, and particularly a widow or an orphan. The children of my brother, the children that are kin to me. That's my obligation. It's not the church's obligation. It's my obligation. What if I push that off on somebody else and say, well, let's just send them off to an orphan's home somewhere?
Well, you're going to have to answer to God for that, because he does say you've denied the faith.
Oh, denied the faith and worse than an unbeliever.
Right.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's go ahead with this. We're running short on time, so we better... What if, all right, I'll give the example again. These are real examples. These are not made up things. This is not what if. African preacher friends of mine who have taken orphans into their homes. I know of one man who has taken his brother died, and he took his children and he's raising them as his own children. He counts them as his own children, and I commend him for that. And he's fulfilling 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. But he doesn't have a high income himself. So what if he's unable to feed those children?
Okay, well, we have examples of what to do as well as instruction. Acts chapter 2, I think, is a good place to start.
Ahead.
Okay, over in Acts chapter 2, this is early on here, as the church is growing, and in Acts chapter 2, we've got kind of a unique situation. Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, that's how Acts chapter 2 starts. It's the day of Pentecost. And so you have the children of Israel from all different locations in the Empire of Rome coming to Jerusalem. And they come there to worship, and they hear Jesus Christ preached, and so they obey and they're baptized. And so you've got all these Christians there together, but a lot of them are out-of-towners, and so they're going to need some help because they're not in their place where they normally live, and they're going to run out of funds probably pretty quickly staying there in Jerusalem. And so you've got a lot of people here, but it tells us in verse 44, it says, "Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need." So for this particular situation, to fulfill the need, and again the word need is used there, not just wants and desires, but a need, they had all things in common. They were sharing. They were sharing with one another, and this is amongst the believers. So in your situation, you brought up about the man in Africa. You know, he can't support those kids that he's taken on, or it's very difficult for him. Well then, yes, the church can share with him, and that's where the church would step in and help that man.
All right.
Help financially.
Okay. Let me, we're running short of time, and there's several things we'd like to say, but let me add a couple of passages to the one that Trevor's already mentioned for you to look at on your own as you have time. This principle is repeated in Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 35. It's repeated in Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, where the church was caring for widows. And so those are other examples of this. But now here's the question. What if the church where this man is a member does not have the capacity to help him out? What's to be done then?
If they're unable to help him out? I'll let you answer that, because offhand I'm not...
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's where members of other congregations step in and help that congregation.
Okay, I see.
And Acts 11, 27 through 30, the brethren in Antioch sent to needy Christians in Judea.
That's right.
And there's three passages, and by the way, get in touch with us if you'd like to know more about these passages. Romans chapter 15, verses 25 and 26. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. And all of 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 mention a collection that Paul took from Gentile churches to help the needy brethren in Jerusalem. So if one congregation does not have the capacity to help its own needy, then brethren from other congregations step in and help. But I want you to see, in all of this, there's not an organization set up separate from the church to receive church money to do the church's work for it. But first of all, individual Christians meet their own obligations. Where they can't, the church steps in and helps those Christians. And where one church cannot handle all its own obligations, then other churches can help that church to meet its obligations. And thus, the Lord has set up a mechanism whereby the benevolent work of Christians is to take place, and it does not include church support of human organizations.
Right, right.
Okay. Well, Trevor, we're running out of time. Tell folks again how to be in touch with you, please.
Yeah, you can contact me by phone, 870-435-2737.
And if you would like to talk more about this question that we've talked about on the air today, we've hit it pretty quickly, or if you have other questions you'd like to ask me, Keith Sharp, then you can get in touch with me by calling 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or you can simply write to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Trevor, real quickly, as we're running out of time, tell them about the services of the Piatt Church of Christ.
Yeah, join us in Piatt on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. for a Bible class and 10:45 for worship. We'd love to have you. We're on 62 in Piatt, next to the tractor dealership.
Thanks so much for watching the program this evening. We hope you'll watch again next time, and be in touch and let us know what your Bible questions are. We'll search the Scriptures together. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas, 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace.